Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest CODA webinar. Very much looking forward to this one, and in a few minutes we'll be hearing from Collin Smith, who is the CEO of the International Centre for Complex Project Management, who will give us an overview of what complex project management is and how it differs from, I guess, what we all have come to know and love as project management. And also apply some context for that work in terms of the decommissioning industry. My name is Francis Norman. I'm CEO Managing Director here at CODA. And just before I introduce Collin, I'll give those who aren't familiar with who we are a real quick rundown just in terms of sort of what we do and some of the work that we've been involved with. So CODA as an organisation, we were established in 2020. We work as an independent not-for-profit, and our role is really to support the establishment and growth of Australia's decommissioning industry, to enable it to do the work that has to be done safely, efficiently, maximise recycling of materials and reuse of materials, and really just grow the industry here to provide that critical mass so that as the volumes grow, we have the capacity here to execute the work that we've got going forwards. So along with running things like webinars, podcasts and so forth, we've done a whole bunch of other deliverables over the last couple of years as well. We've looked at planning and execution learnings, and that was one of the real triggers for starting to look at having conversations like this one. How do we learn? How do we learn from other industries? How do we learn from other people doing decommissioning in terms of just how to do it better, how to do it to the maximum extent? We've also done work looking at technology roadmaps, risk disposal, recycling, skills gaps, which again surfaced that project management is an area where we have some real need for some learnings. And training is a big part of what we focused on as well. We offer twice a year, we do a 2-day introduction to decommissioning conference that we run, that we just finished 2 weeks ago. So the skills piece is a real focus for us in building the decommissioning industry. One of the things that we're really proud of that we released a few weeks ago was what you're seeing running as a bit of a model on the screen, I guess. And this was a piece of work that we undertook to really map out the size, shape and timeline for all the decommissioning work that's coming up in Australia. So we went out, we scraped all of the environmental plans that are hosted by NOPSEMA, harvested from that the quantities of all the materials for every facility that's operating in Australian waters. And then we overlaid with that the timelines for all the decommissioning work. So we now have a really, really good picture of what our decommissioning future could look like. Obviously, we don't and can't say in there what the end state is for any of this, but we've got what we believe to be some of the best data and the best accessible data as well for what's just going to happen in the decom space. And what that looks like across the whole country for the next, out until 2060 is what you're seeing on the screen right now. We still have 740 wells that are classed as active. We've got 54 facilities that are still out there in one shape or another 10 floating facilities, and thousands of kilometres of infield flow lines, umbilicals, flexibles, plus thousands more kilometres of pipelines as well, all of which we have to decide as an industry what the end state is going to be going into the future. So there is a huge amount of decommissioning work coming up in front of us now, right through, massive volume, as you can see on this, out until 2040, but then still ongoing work volumes out into through the 2040s, 2050s. Who knows? We'll see when we get that far out. One thing we're also looking at doing right now, and this is something that will be in the email that you'll get shortly after the webinar finishes, is we're looking at establishing a project management special interest group. We've just embarked on establishing these special interest groups. We've started to build the first one at the moment, which is looking at waste management and hazardous materials. We really wanted to get a sense if there's an interest out there from across industry in terms of having a special interest group for project management in the decommissioning space. So when you see the form come out, please watch out for that particular question in there. If we get enough interest, then it will be something we'll look to kick off probably early in the new year. And then just before I wrap up, we couldn't do any of the stuff that we do without our enormous and amazing partner network. We've just recently hit over 130 partners now. and you can see the logos of most of them on the screen right now. There's always a couple that have just come in that we haven't managed to actually capture and build into this platform yet. But 130 partners and growing is just a phenomenal network of organizations for us to be able to reach out to and engage with as we go forwards. So that's it from my part. I'm going to loiter in the background and take notes and so forth. If you've got questions, or when you've got questions for Collin as he goes through his material, please put anything that you've got either in the chat or in the Q&A. We will monitor both. If you see that someone else has already put one in, one or the other of those, then please put it in the same one, because that just makes my life a bit easier at this end. But on that note, Collin, I would like to invite you, please, to turn on your camera and join us for your part of this.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, Francis, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you on this CODA webinar. As Francis said, my name is Collin Smith. I'm the CEO of the International Centre for Complex Project Management, and in this webinar today, we are going to have a look at exploring what makes a decommissioning project complex and the implications for their delivery. So after this webinar, you should be able to understand the difference between simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic problem contexts and their implications, understand what can escalate a project from a simple state to a complex state, understand why organizations need to operate systemically to deliver complex projects, and then some understanding of a different set of skills and competencies that are required to navigate project complexity, and a very brief introduction to our complex project leadership competency standards. But as Francis did on behalf of CODA, let me also just take a moment to introduce ICCPM is how we like to shorten our name, the International Centre for Complex Project Management. We were established in 2007 by the Australian federal government as the peak body for complex project management. But importantly, we are not government. We are an independent, not-for-profit, membership-based organization, both individual and organizational. And we are the custodians of a set of competency standards around complex project leadership on behalf of the federal government of Australia. And we exist to build organizational capability to improve the outcome of complex projects. We do all the things that you would expect from a professional association or peak body, and you can see some of those activities listed on that slide. But that gives you a sense of who we are. And what I'd like to do now is jump immediately into the content of this webinar, starting with a conversation around the understanding of differences between simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic problem contexts. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Cynefin framework that you can see on your screen right now, this is a framework that is quite popular and is taught in many management courses nowadays, including project management courses, and it's very useful to understand the difference between these problem contexts. There is so much rich data here that we won't be able to cover. We could probably spend 45 minutes just on this slide alone. And when you see various different examples of the Cynefin framework, they vary in terms of the level of detail of the content that is described on the actual slide or whatever literature it is you're looking at. For our purposes today, it's a light touch, and I wanted just to highlight some of the distinctions, focusing on some of the characteristics, starting with simple down at the bottom right. And the important thing to understand here is when we are facing a simple problem in a project context, we're talking about a situation where things are tightly constrained, there are no degrees of freedom, and so we apply best practice. When we move up to the top right-hand quadrant, we're here talking about complicated problems, and here we have to recognize that we're dealing with governing constraints that are tightly coupled. And again, moving on to the top left quadrant, where we're concerned with complex problems, the distinction here is that we're dealing with enabling constraints that are loosely coupled, and that implies that there are degrees of unknown factors that we're having to deal with. And then finally, in the chaotic quadrant, we're really facing a situation where we have a lack of constraints and where these things are decoupled one from another. But our focus is on the complex quadrant, being the International Center for Complex Project Management. And so what I wanted to highlight here, although, as I said, there's plenty more that can be said about Cynefin, is that complex problems are characterized predominantly by uncertainty and ambiguity and the presence of numerous interconnecting variables that make it very difficult to determine the relationship between cause and effect. But if we focus just primarily on this uncertainty, then it's useful to point out that we live in a uncertain world. And this is a uncertainty index, a world uncertainty index that shows a trend line of increasing uncertainty in terms of global events. Now, this goes up with its peak around the coronavirus, but since then, of course, there are other global events that have introduced uncertainty, and we can add to this what's happening in Israel and Iran and Lebanon and so forth. The point being here is that we live in a globally interconnected world, a sort of system of systems, where these large global events have trickle-down impacts on our projects and programs in terms of the uncertainty that they introduce due to disruptions in things like supply chains and various other instances. So if you consider the two things that are important to be able to achieve almost anything in life, and particularly when we think of projects, what we need is control and certainty. If we have control and certainty, we can literally achieve anything. So on this graph, you can see a relationship between control and certainty. And when we have lots of control and lots of certainty, well, those are the instances where we can describe them as simple. These are simple problems. There are few variables, and the cause and effect relationship is clear. And the goal here is efficiency. We're looking for systems and practices and processes that are repeatable, and we rely on technical process knowledge. However, the further away we get from certainty and control, the more complicated things become. This is when we're dealing with more variables. And although the relationship between cause and effect may not be immediately obvious, it is discoverable. So the goal here shifts to not only efficiency, but also effectiveness. Are we doing the right things in the most efficient way? And so we're concerned with repeatable processes, but with modification. And the focus here is on subject matter expert knowledge. So these are usually your technical sort of engineering related type problems. And of course, the further we get still from certainty and control, the more complex things become. This is a situation where we have many interacting variables, where cause and effect is only known often in retrospect because things are not tightly linked. And so here, importantly, the goal shifts from efficiency and effectiveness to learning by doing and to adaptability. We rely here on multiple perspectives in order to generate knowledge about the situation, the context of the situation. Now, it doesn't mean to say that efficiency and effectiveness as a goal goes away, but the primacy is shifted to learning by doing and adaptability. And of course, then beyond that, when you enter into a chaotic situation, well, then you're in an entirely different context, in a world of pain, and that's not particularly the focus of this webinar. So I'm going to leave that there for the time being. What I'd like to share with you is some further insights that come from one of our thought leadership series in 2018-2019, where we looked at leadership as the game changer in large-scale complex projects. And through our roundtable workshops, both locally and internationally, where we gather together subject matter experts, academics, practitioners, and so forth, to distill their lived experiences in projects and programs, what we learned was that leadership of complex projects is dependent on two factors, and you can see them here on the X and Y axes. And it is, or has to do, should I say, with the leader's capacity for complexity and the leader's perception of complexity. Because complexity, project complexity, that is, isn't always obvious. It requires a certain capacity to be able to perceive that complexity. And so what we propose here is that leaders of complex projects necessarily require three different lenses or visions of projects that illuminate different aspects of the project. So you can think of these as lenses, glasses that you put on that help you to put the spotlight on different aspects of the project. The first one is project as asset, and through that lens, we place the focus on all of the technical aspects that are related to the physical asset, the thing that the project is about. So whether that is to build the asset, or in the case of decommissioning, to deconstruct the asset and to dispose of the asset and or to recycle and so forth. It puts the focus on the technical components related to the physical asset at the core of the project. And this draws on an expert action logic. That is to say, we rely on subject matter expertise, typically engineering expertise, but also the technical project management process driven kind of methodological approach to delivering projects. But we have to recognize that that is not the only lens, and that projects, or assets anyway, are not delivered in a vacuum. There is a larger system which is responsible for that project. And that comprises all of the stakeholders that you would identify in relation to your projects: customers, suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, regulatory agencies, etc. All of the stakeholders that necessarily have to come together to cooperate and to coordinate in order to achieve a common goal. And that draws on an achiever action logic. That is to say, leaders use systems insights in order to achieve those common objectives. And then finally, the third vision is project as asset, or third lens, if you like, which draws on a strategic action logic and recognizes that, at least for the time being, who knows what robots and AI is going to bring in the future, but for the time being, projects are delivered by people. Projects are essentially human activity systems. And the way that we engage with people is through conversation. From a strategic perspective, as a leader, what we need to be able to do in relation to projects is to engage with the right people about the right things at the right time in order to achieve the higher purpose, the greater purpose of what it is the project is about. So that project as conversation lifts the conversation from the process transactional based sort of technical aspects, which are nevertheless important, but not the only part of the project. And each successive vision incorporates the vision before it. So it's not an either or thing, it's an and both thing. Now, this junction, this nexus between project as system and project as conversation is where we are concerned. Other professional bodies, project management associations, typically focus on this area, the project management methodological process-driven technical competency. We focus on complex project leadership, which is really about reframing stakeholder interactions. So I mentioned that we view projects as systems, and I said that we view them as human activity systems. But if I was to introduce a technical term, these human activity systems are referred to as complex adaptive systems. and you'll see on the screen complex adaptive open systems as opposed to closed systems. These systems are soft systems also as opposed to hard systems. So to try to explain that concept very briefly, I've got a little animated slide, and we can begin to understand these projects as complex adaptive systems or as human activity systems by firstly identifying the projecteer, but then we can beyond that identify all of the stakeholders, as I mentioned previously, and we can think of these stakeholders as agents or parts of the system. But of course, because it's a human activity system, we're thinking here about people, whether individuals or groups or organizations. We can draw a boundary around that and identify that as the project system. And that boundary helps us to understand what's in and what's out in terms of identifying the project. Now, a typical view of business process transformation is based on a hard system, which is deterministic. Think manufacturing or production line type processes, where you've got a system that is designed in advance to achieve a known output based on known inputs and a transformation of those inputs to outputs. However, in a soft system, a human activity system, we're interested in the relationships and the interactions between parts, people that is, and the fact that we can identify subsystems within the project system, and so we can understand a relationship between systems nested within systems in a human activity system. So what we get through that interaction is a sort of dynamic, non-linear interaction between people, constrained by the system's rules, the system's purpose, and its interaction with the external environment. And we can observe this through feedback loops. And that produces emergence. And that emergence is produced within the system from the interaction between the agents, but also between the system and the interaction of the system with its external environment. Now, the distinction here between hard systems and soft systems is important because in a deterministic hard system, the path from inputs to outputs is known in advance, and it's clear and it's linear. However, in complex adaptive systems, human activity systems, in other words, projects, the path from inputs to outputs is anything but linear, and it's sometimes unclear. And so that represents the complexity that we have to navigate in order to get from inputs, importantly, not to outputs, but to outcomes. And the distinction between outputs and outcomes is very important because it implies that we have to hold to our plans and our expectations, in some instances, temporarily. So we have to hold them loosely, and we have to be prepared to respond and adjust and adapt accordingly based on the emergent events, both within our system and from the external environment. So what we can say, therefore, about working with complexity in projects is that complex situations are characterized by a degree of disorder, instability, emergence, nonlinearity, recursiveness, uncertainty, randomness, and so on. And of course, to greater or lesser extents at different times throughout the project's life cycle. There is a dynamic to these human activity systems such that the parts in the system can react and interact with each other in different ways, and they are connected, and the stakeholders often have multiple divergent views, and these systems change over time as they adapt to the environment. So what does this mean for decommissioning projects? What are the implications? Well, since the nature of complex decommissioning projects is determined, at least in part, by the interaction between its stakeholders and the external environment, the relationships are fundamental. And so what we have to begin to do is to think about decommissioning projects in a different way. We have to shift our thinking from a fit-for-purpose kind of approach to more of a fit for context kind of approach, from a just in time to a just in case kind of approach, from a focus on efficiency to a focus on resilience, being able to be adaptable and to change based on emergence in the environment in which we are doing these projects. From an input transformation output to inputs, collaborative interactions, outcomes. And we need to be able to embrace the provisionality of these plans, be open to adapting them, and to design new paths forward as we emerge, as paths emerge, should I say. And that is a very, very difficult thing to do. It requires a particular kind of skill set, and particularly for organizations that are accustomed to a sort of command and control kind of approach. So the question that then arises is, what can escalate a project from a simple state to a complex state? Because projects have different life cycle phases, and not all projects are complex in their entirety. Projects of any significance will have simple, complicated, complex, and even chaotic parts to them. So the factors that influence the escalation of a project from a simple to a complex state would include things like scale, uncertainty, environmental dynamics, interdependencies, stakeholder behaviors, and so forth. So let's think of these in the context of decommissioning projects, looking at scale first. Well, decommissioning projects are often large in scale. These undertakings are extensive. They require lots of planning, lots of resources, lots of vast engineering undertakings under the environmental considerations and safety challenges. So scale is certainly a factor in many decommissioning projects. If we consider uncertainty, well, often we have to do early evaluations of asset integrity and operability in these decommissioning projects. And that's necessary to manage the risk and costs effectively. There are often decades of these projects, these structures that mean that there is a degree of uncertainty as to the original design and engineering plans and adaptations and add-ons that have happened in the meantime, and the integrity of that particular asset at any point in time. So lots of uncertainties there. From an environmental perspective, well, decommissioning projects have to consider extensive regulations that are designed to protect humans and the environment. And this is particularly true in the case of nuclear and offshore oil and gas and so forth. If we consider interdependencies, for example, well, decommissioning has a system-wide sort of environmental impact, where there's a need for feedback-oriented strategies to mitigate unpredictable outcomes. So there are lots of interdependencies that also mean that there is a relationship with uncertainties. And stakeholder behavior is another important factor. In decommissioning projects, we have to be aware of and pay attention to the potential exposure risks for the communities around these assets when they are decommissioned and dismantled and transported and processed, and when rehabilitation takes place in the environment and so forth. And so what we can safely say is that decommissioning projects are complex. There's no doubt about that. And when we consider further the implications of decommissioning projects, well, then we think about decommissioning projects having infrastructure that relies on interconnected systems, where one part's breakdown affects the overall operation. And although that is a hard systems kind of consideration, it has soft systems implications, because decommissioning projects feature high interdependence across regulatory, technical, and environmental layers, which kind of constitutes the soft systems relationship between nested systems in a sort of systems of systems environment. In decommissioning projects, there is a need for adaptive solutions that respond to real-time technical challenges in dismantling and transportation, for example. And this means that we're dealing with nonlinear dynamics. Adaptive nonlinear strategies are necessary to manage the uncertainties and interconnections between elements of these projects. We need to pay attention to feedback loops in waste management, for example, because disposal generates cascading effects across things like handling, containment, environmental safety systems, and so forth. And that really means that we have to be managing emergent behaviors. There's a need to manage emergent behaviors in project phases like waste containment, site decontamination, etc. And so what this means really is that organizations have to operate systemically in order to deliver complex projects successfully. Why is this? Well, because we know that project delivery is not simply a mechanistic process of executing identified project activities. There is that too, but there is more to it. Project delivery is not simply a mechanistic process of executing identified project activities. There is that as well. But the problem often is that we do our planning and we have expectations that are based on sitting around the boardroom table, assuming that things are linear and static and stable. And so we do our plans, which are necessary. But the reality is when we take those plans into the real world, we realize that the real world is quite different and to a greater extent, much more uncertain and unpredictable than what we would like to have assumed in our plan, for example. And so the need to operate systemically is because that helps us to understand interdependencies. It helps us to navigate complexities. It helps us to anticipate unintended consequences and to embrace adaptability and resilience. It helps with collaboration and integration. It helps to optimize resources. It helps with continuous learning and improvement and with emphasizing the whole system. So navigating project complexity is therefore fundamentally a leadership skill rather than a management skill. Not that the management skills are unimportant, but that is the distinction here. When we consider conventional project management methodology, we can see that project management methodology is focused on administrative management. Primacy is given to scope, cost, and time. Whereas when we compare that with complex project leadership, which is mostly concerned with an adaptive and enabling kind of leadership, where primacy is given to realizing project outcomes, aligning with business strategy, navigating the complexity, and negotiating project success. With project management methodology, it's a reductionist approach stemming from a rational, universal, and deterministic paradigm. With complex project leadership, it's about a holistic approach. And so what we can say is that project management methodology is mostly about managing the things and the tasks that the project is about, whereas complex project leadership is about leading the people involved in delivering the projects as part of a complex, adaptive human activity system. Now, importantly, both are necessary in order to achieve successful complex project delivery outcomes. But far too often the focus is placed on the methodological process-driven aspects of projects, and what is largely ignored is the softer system sides, the complex project leadership stuff, and that is the focus of ICCPM. And what makes complex project management or leadership in this case different to the traditional approach to delivering projects through methodological processes on their own. So the challenges that are faced by leaders of complex projects are not only things like quality, cost, and time, or scope, budget, schedule, those sorts of things, but also things like achieving strategic alignment between project partners, establishing and maintaining an effective multidisciplinary team with a shared purpose, for example, monitoring the changing project environment and adapting when necessary, aligning the project governance, that is, connecting the adaptive and enabling leadership function with the administrative management function. So that's that symbiotic relationship between the soft aspects with the more hard process, linear, deterministic type stuff. And of course, delivering the broader project objectives beyond the identified project tasks that need to be executed. We have to take into account all of the other things that are important in relation to achieving project outcomes, and being able to engage with multiple and diverse stakeholders with a vested interest in the project. So you might remember this slide that I introduced earlier on. And what I'd want to do is just tie some of these things that we've been through back to that slide. So firstly, complex project leadership has a dual value proposition together with project management methodology. We need both. Project methodology is based on that input process, output linear kind of deterministic view of how to do projects. It's a transactional process-driven methodology, necessary. You need to do that. You can't deliver projects without it, but insufficient when confronted with complexity, and therefore we need the complex project leadership skills and competencies, because that focuses on the higher order critical thinking and decision-making skills. It's holistic information gathering, analysis, synthesis, evaluation, decision, feedback loops, etc. And so that is what achieves the outcomes necessary. And so there's a dual value proposition there. They run parallel to one another. And the key is understanding when to put the focus on one over the other in terms of primacy at given moments of time throughout the project lifecycle phases. So project management methodology, as we said, is focused on goal efficiency and effectiveness, technical process knowledge, subject matter expertise, and so forth, and very, very useful and necessary for simple and complicated problem contexts. Whereas complex project leadership is around learning by doing, adaptability, engaging with multiple perspectives, trying to learn as you go by generating knowledge about the problem context, and that's useful for complex projects where you don't have a formula to follow, you don't necessarily have a recipe, you don't have all the answers in advance, and you have to work together with stakeholders to co-create the path forward in order to achieve the project's outcomes. So based on that context setting, that kind of rationale for the difference between complex project leadership and the traditional framing of project management competencies that are focused on quality, cost, time, scope, schedules, those sorts of things, hopefully you can begin to appreciate that there is a different kind of set of skills and competencies that are necessary, that complement the traditional project management framing and taxonomy. And it's that which is required to be able to navigate the complexity in projects. And so I wanted to introduce you to these complex project leadership competency standards. And as you can see, there's a QR code on the screen that you can use to download a free copy of those standards. We won't have time to go through them in any great detail today in this webinar, but that is a publicly accessible document, and I encourage you either to use the QR code or just to simply go to our website and to navigate your way through to find where you can download those standards. As I said previously, we hold those standards on behalf of the Commonwealth of Australia. You'll see there's a foreword by the Deputy Secretary of the Australian Department of Defence Capability Acquisition and Sustainment Group, which is essentially the largest project management part of the federal government. But these are not defence standards. It's just that happened to be the single biggest project part of government. They are, in fact, universally applicable across all industry sectors, and so don't be misled by the fact that the forward is signed by a representative from the Department of Defense. So what I wanted to highlight very briefly about these standards is that there are 5 high-level units of competency. These are sort of the big buckets of competency, and you can see them listed here, 5 of them. Each of them have a sort of definition that you can read for yourself. I don't think we have time to go through that in any great detail, but I'll focus on the high level and you can read some of this description for yourself. But what we have here is units of competency that range from drive systemic thinking and action to focus strategically on delivering project outcomes, to engage collaboratively with stakeholders, to exercising contextual leadership awareness, and to finally apply systems governance and delivery assurance. And you can see that those are quite different to things like quality, cost, time, the proverbial sort of iron triangle of the traditional framing of project management methodology. And to reiterate, we're not saying that that is not necessary. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can't do projects without those conventional methodological parts, but they are insufficient when dealing with complexity. So we have to have this complementary skill set as part of our toolbox in order to be able to navigate the complexity. Now, the way that the standards are structured is that you have these big buckets, the units of competency, but for each of those units of competency, you have a range of elements. And for each of those elements, you have a range of performance criteria. And so you have a cascading kind of relationship between unit of competency, the elements, and the performance criteria. The rest of the detail I will leave to you to read for yourself in the standards document, and I encourage you to download that. But that effectively brings me to the end of my presentation. I just wanted to revisit the objectives that we set for this webinar, which is that we said we would help you to understand the difference between simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic project contexts. I hope we've at least teased you with a little bit of that. There's plenty more that we could talk about there, but you've had a basic introduction there. We said we would talk about what escalates a project from a simple state to a complex state. I gave you some examples. I hope that's whet your appetite. We said that organizations need to operate systemically. We gave reasons for that. And then I've very briefly explained the need for why there is a competency standard called complex project leadership, and given you a basic introduction to that, but pointed you rather to the downloading off of the website of that set of competency standards for more detailed consumption. So thank you very much for attending and for spending this time with me. I hope you found it informative, and I'm happy to take some questions here, and we also will make a copy of these slides available to you, so that'll be sent out by CODA. But I'll stop slide sharing for now and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Collin. That was really interesting. You know, I've heard you go through this a few times before, and every time I do, I hear new bits. So, no, thanks very much for that. We've had a couple of questions. I've got one that I'll maybe kick off with, and then I'll move across to the others. As ICCPM, you obviously work across a whole range of different industries. So you see complexity probably everywhere you go, I imagine, whether you want to or not. How would you say what you're seeing in the decommissioning space would compare to some of those other industries that you work with? I mean, are there sort of parallels, or are there examples that you would point to?
Yeah, you know, the thing with complexity is that it is not exclusive to any particular industry. All industries face varying degrees of complexity. The difference is really the specifics that are characteristic of those particular industries, but the underlying complexity remains the same. So, for example, when we talk about things like uncertainty and ambiguity and volatility, there will be specific examples in the decommissioning context that may be different to perhaps what we might find in the defense sector or perhaps in infrastructure. But nevertheless, what those examples represent is uncertainty, ambiguity, volatility. Obviously there is much more to complexity than just volatility, uncertainty, and ambiguity. I've used that as a sort of a brief indication in this webinar, but we no doubt in our training courses delve much deeper into that. We identify, in fact, 5 sources of complexity. And those sources, again, would be evident across industries, but each of the examples would take on the industry-specific context, the flavor of those things. So there's crossover too, because if you just pick, for example, the defense sector, we all know, whether you're a defense person or not, just paying attention to the media, you know that Australia has an arrangement called AUKUS with the United States of America and the UK around nuclear-powered submarines. And if you just follow that through in terms of the temporal complexity of that particular endeavor, there will be decommissioning aspects around the nuclear industrial base that is necessary in order to support those nuclear-powered submarines. And so you've got the uncertainty related to how do we deal with nuclear waste, for example, which is a crossover between the decommissioning and the defense sectors. You've got aspects like having to gain a social license, so to speak, from the community in which those projects will exist and will impact. So again, whether it's a oil and gas rig, or whether it's a nuclear processing plant, or whatever it is, we have to get stakeholder buy-in. We have to get a social license. And those would be examples that are similar across industry sectors. I could continue, but I hope that was useful.
No, that was good.
Answer the question.
That was good.
I'll allow you to answer.
No, that was great.
Additional questions.
Got a couple of questions here. I'll go through now. So Craig's asked, and this was something that you touched on about 20 minutes ago in your presentation. So if you can wind your mind back to that one, could you define fit for context rather than fit for purpose? You used that term as you were going through some of your material.
Yes, in fact, the example I've just given with the social license that is required might be a good way to understand fit for context, because fit for purpose puts the focus on project as asset. It puts that lens on. Fit for purpose is the asset constructed or deconstructed in a way that is appropriate and that meets all the technical requirements in terms of all the engineering components. That is fit for purpose. But fit for context is to understand the way in which we do that, considering the community at large, the stakeholders that are involved, and particularly stakeholders that may not be involved in a hands-on way in the project execution and or delivery, but that are nevertheless powerful as stakeholders. And I'm just extending this one example of the sort of social license, because the environment in which we live and work today, with the advances in technology and the invention of things like social media, for example, makes things more complex for us when we're dealing with these sensitive kinds of projects, because through the enabling of social media, you can get a groundswell where stakeholders who otherwise are several layers removed from the actual project activity suddenly can coalesce, become enormously powerful as a lobby group through social media and have a tremendous impact on your project. And hence why we have to understand the fit for context. What is the context for this? We can't just approach the decommissioning project from a technical engineering perspective. We have to understand the environmental aspects, the context of the social community, of the social license from community, the context of the environmental impacts, and so on and so forth.
Very good. So this next one, I'll paraphrase it a little bit, but it actually does link in a bit to what you were talking about there with the stakeholder side of things. What strategies do you use to align with stakeholder perception when managing complex projects, particularly looking at things like risk management and technology advancement in these complex spaces? Presumably that's bringing in even more complexity once you start looking at changes of technologies and things as well.
Yeah. Well, so the first thing, I suppose, is to appreciate that we have to consider what constitutes project success. The traditional view of project success is based on the iron triangle: quality, cost, time. And if you don't meet the budget, and it's not delivered on time, and it's not to the specifications, well, then your project is unsuccessful. But what we suggest is that there are multiple different ways to measure success. And if we take an example from other professions, for example, the finance and accounting profession, when you consider something like the measure of profitability of an organization, there are multiple different ways of slicing and dicing an understanding of success. For example, we can look at project before tax, after tax, before depreciation, after depreciation, before and after exceptional items, before and after amortization, etc. All of these different perspectives of what constitutes a measure of success if success is based on profitability. Well, for projects, we have to consider that success is different from one stakeholder to another. And that means that we have to engage with stakeholders in a way that we negotiate success from stakeholder grouping to stakeholder grouping by understanding the stakeholder needs, the stakeholder expectations, and being able to balance those different stakeholder perceptions and expectations based on their motivations. I always give an example of the divide between government and industry. If you're contracted by government to deliver a particular project, whatever it might be, you can be sure that government as a stakeholder is less concerned about profitability as a measure of success than what you might be as an industry service provider. That's not to say that they're uninterested, but if you understand the perspective of stakeholders from where they are, if you have a genuine sort of stakeholder focus where stakeholders are valued and seen as legitimate stakeholders that have rights and expectations, then you have to be able to put yourself in their shoes and understand what's important to them and negotiate various aspects of project success in relation to that stakeholder engagement. Did I answer the question? Was there a second part to that question?
I'll take that one as an answer. That was good. In the interest of time, I've got one last question which I'll ask you, and then we'll aim to finish like all good projects should, at least within our allocated schedule. And that's really if people have been watching this and thinking this is something I really need to embrace and sort of embed in the way that either I or my organization leads its projects. What recommendations would you have for people to help to evolve the systems and the environment that they're working in to become more trying to think of the right terminology here, but to more embrace the concepts of complex project management, what you've talked about here?
Well, I guess it comes down to knowledge, awareness, So, yeah, I made reference in my presentation to complexity requiring a certain capacity to be able to perceive the complexity. It's not something that is obvious in most instances. And typically, when we look at project management tools and documentation like the business case, the budget, the schedule, those sort of things, we don't typically, and even the risk register, that was the second part of that question,
It was.
Francis. We don't typically see these complexity aspects listed in risk registers or budgets or business plans or benefits realization plans or schedules and so on. So you have to educate yourself about that. You have to have a common vocabulary that you can share amongst your colleagues so that you have an awareness, you can recognize and identify the complexity, and then you can gain some degree of consensus amongst your stakeholders as to what the perceived complexity is, and then from there you move to what can be done about that. So from ICCPM, we have the standards which define what good looks like, but then we have a series of professional development offerings, short courses, recognized qualifications and so forth that are all mapped to those standards, which is part of the learning journey that we offer. But then there is also keeping your head in the game, because we know that adult learning just happens 10% through formal sort of learning in the class. uh, 20% of it happens sort of by keeping your head in the game, being part of a community of practice. You spoke about setting up a special interest group for CODA. Well, that's part of how you keep your head in the game. And we have our own special interest groups as well, which would be quite different to CODA's. I don't think there's any overlap there. So I'd invite you to join CODA's special interest group. I'd invite you to join ICCPM's special interest group. And that cross-pollination across different people, across different industry examples and so forth, is what keeps you in your head in the game. As CODA would have, we have newsletters, we have a magazine every quarter, we have a webinar series, all those things keep your head in the game. And then the 70%, so this is adult learning theory, 70-20-10. The 70% is on-the-job training. So you take what you're aware of through your learnings to keeping your head in the game, and you apply it in the workplace. And you get it wrong sometimes, you learn from that and you try again. And so it's a learning journey. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, look, that was excellent. Look, thank you again, Colin, for taking an hour out of your day to present this. It was, from my perspective, very, very interesting, very clear, very easy to follow, and really, really informative. We will share with the email that goes out with this contact details for anybody that's on the webinar, either live or watching it as a recording, so you can get in touch with Colin. We'll be sharing the slides, and the webinar will hopefully be up on our YouTube channel within the next few days. And on that, look, I'll say thank you everybody for joining and staying with us, and thank you again, Colin, for sharing all your knowledge. It's been great. Thank you very much, my friend.
My pleasure. Thank you, Francis. Cheerio.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
having me.
See you all.